I mean, we have a local DJ to it. I don't know if you know her. No? Oh. Okay. Mix it tea? No? Doesn't make sense? It's okay. I'll try to find them. Yeah, look them up. You might like it. Yeah. Hi everyone. Hello. It's wonderful to see so many beautiful smiling faces on a kind of rainy Tuesday. If this is your first time in the center, welcome. If you have returned, if you've been here many times, thank you for coming back and always continuing to engage with us in discussion and education and community and all those wonderful things. If you don't know who I am, my name is Odette Marie Rodriguez, and I'm the program coordinator at the Center for Women's Studies. So this is Welcome to the Center for Women's Studies and LGBTQ Initiatives. Excuse me. I always get out of breath. I just have to calm down. The Center for Women's Studies recognizes our collective responsibility to acknowledge our colonial history. Our campus sits on the unceded traditional lands of the Oneida Nation. We recognize that discussions of gender and other systemic issues cannot exist without acknowledging the influence Haudenosaunee women had and have on feminist movements. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. Join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. So if you all don't know, I have interns that work in the office, and some of them will be doing introductions so you get to know their faces. So I'm going to pass the mic off to Bilal, who will introduce himself. Thank you, Bilal.
Hello, thank you, Odette. Hello, people. Welcome to Center for Women's Studies. If you don't know me already, I'm Bilal, junior. Pronouns he and his. I'm the technology resource intern for the Center for Women's Studies. Without further ado, I'm going to plug some upcoming events that all of you should be in the loop about. One such event being on this Friday, which is Los Paneros de la 21 Free Community Engagement Workshop, which is at the Palace at 7 o'clock. And there is a concert on Saturday at 8 p.m. as a joint event. Another thing happening next week is right up there, Raising a Ruckus, which is next week's roundup? Yes, next week's roundup. So for some context, Sonia Renee Taylor is an author, artist, and activist who is also the founder and radical executive officer of The Body is Now Anthology, an international movement and organization committed to radical self-love and body empowerment as the foundational tool for justice and global transformation. And also, she's the author of a best-selling book, The Body is Now Anthropology, Power of Radical Self-Love. So definitely show out to that next week.
Woo!
Woo! Get happy. It's expensive.
God. And also, LGBTQ Studies will be celebrating its 10th anniversary with the LGBTQ Studies Symposium, which begins next Thursday with a lecture/performance by alum Karim Khubchandani, Lessons in Drag with Lahore Bajistan, next Thursday, 7 p.m. in Golden Auditorium. And as some further guidelines for those who haven't been to Brownback before, and during the presentation and Q&A portion, please remember to use microphones to ensure accessibility, and also As the brown bag wraps up, be sure to clean up any food, plates, or anything around you. And if you be generous enough to also help out the interns, which include me and Tenzin, to stack up the chairs after, that would also be appreciated. One by one onto the racks. Don't try to grab like 5 and then slam them on. And now I'll pass it back to Odette, who's eager to introduce the speakers.
Paul just has bad flashbacks to stacking chairs, so he's just trying to get some help.
I learned from the I learned
All right, so I'm happy to have you all here today and to introduce our speaker for today. Caleb is a working class, fat, brown, queer living, writing, and dancing in Oakland, California. Their work explores the intersections of fatness, desire, fetishism, white supremacy, and colonialism from a queer of color lens. You can find their writing on Black Girl Dangerous, Everyday Feminism, and The Body is Not an Apology. So without further ado, I give you Caleb Luna. Thank you.
Hey everyone. Oh, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Hi, I'm gonna sit. Does this work for everyone? Great. Hi, good morning, and thank you for being here and choosing to spend your lunchtime with me. I am really overwhelmed and in awe of the turnout. So thank you everyone for coming. Before I get to my talk, I want to begin with just reiterating what Odette said, that we are on the unceded land of the United People, a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Thank you. We are here because this land is occupied, but I want to honor that this always has been and always will be Indigenous land, and remind us that we have an obligation to honor and protect the land, whose nutrients and resources in turn sustain us. I also want to thank Odette for inviting me and being so gracious and hosting me and being sensitive to my accommodations. I really appreciate it. It has been a pleasant trip because of that, so thank you. So I'm here today to talk about what anti-racist fat politics might look like, especially in opposition to, or perhaps beside, what is considered mainstream body positivity. So the starting place, let's take some time to define what I mean, or what we mean by body positivity, or BOPO for short. I'm sure many of us in this room are familiar with this rising movement, which attempts to argue against dominant beauty standards to uplift all bodies. Common refrains of this movement are such platitudes like all bodies are beautiful, love yourself, etc., etc. These kinds of mantras that are meant to combat hundreds of years of conditioning through the privileging of some bodies and oppressing of others. And so this movement, loosely defined, usually centers and also stagnates around body size, acknowledging that we are all indoctrinated into a culture of not just fat phobia, but hating our bodies wholly, regardless of the size. And so as anecdotal evidence for this, I want to recall an Instagram post that I saw once. And for context, I saw this post a while ago, and so I don't remember who it was, and I'm recalling it from memory, but it stuck out to me as kind of exemplary of this kind of movement. And also the specifics feel less important to me as it functioned, again, as exemplary of the kind of mainstream body positivity movement. And the post was a somewhat typical post for gay Instagram, featuring a normally attractive, meaning reasonably fit, light-skinned, bearing no visible scars or disabilities, cis man standing in front of a mirror, flexing and posing in his underwear. The caption read something like, body positive, but I still want to make some gains, meaning muscle gains. So in short, the user appropriated body positive language and frameworks to attempt to make peace with a body he was unhappy with, despite it already fitting comfortably within frameworks of mainstream beauty, while simultaneously uplifting it. Even more, the post was not an attempt to make peace with his body where it was in relation to whatever ideal he was comparing himself to, which is what I think the original intention of BOPO can claim to be. Instead, he was trying to make space to make peace with his body on a journey to further assimilation into oppressive beauty standards through a fitness journey of muscularity, which men in the mainstream gay community tend to fetishize as an avatar of idealized masculinity. And this is evident as the post also functioned a bit as what the kids today would call a thirst trap, As I mentioned, he was posting and flexing in his underwear, or he was posing in his underwear and flexing, showing off in an attempt to draw attention to the attractiveness of his body and hail others into seeing it also. And so one of the things I want to emphasize in this talk and in my work broadly is that, one, fat phobia doesn't only impact fat people. Even non-fat people are impacted, most obviously by being pressured into habits that they presume will not produce fatness in their body, but also by being encouraged to be unhappy with themselves for inevitably failing the dominant standards of embodiment. Because, as a reminder, beauty standards are an ideal. They are by definition impossible to achieve without, as you see with celebrities, the best surgeons, doctors, stylists, trainers, nutritionists, personal chefs, etc. who spend literally all of their time efforting to produce this particular kind of body. And this is because fat phobia or fatness has been tainted with such negative connotations, most obviously as ugly. So a proximity to fatness rhetorically positions some people closer to what they perceive as ugly or uglier. And drawing on Mycroft Jones's essay in the anthology Queering Fat Embodiment, titled The Performance of Fat, The Spectre Outside the House of Desire, I consider fatness to be a kind of floating, somewhat ambiguous signifier. Jones asserts that the ambiguity of who can be fat presents it as this ever-present specter, which shapes most of our lives. As Jones asserts, fat is somewhat amorphous sometimes, which bodies can be cast into, but it is a difficult designation to shed. Right, so once somebody is labeled fat, it's difficult to escape it, especially within our own anxious thought processes, regardless of like what our actual body size is, right? But sometimes our habits can be labeled as fat, or we can say we feel fat, regardless of like what our actual body looks like. Which informs why so many people are anxious about their location and proximity to it. And so that's my second point, that under fat phobia, we're all conditioned to hate our bodies, even if they're fat. And this is what makes body positivity such an appealing and even somewhat necessary movement. On some level, it does recognize this fact that many of us are trained to be unhappy with our bodies, but specifically how they look, as opposed to how they function or what they do for us. And this is the mindset that structures the mainstream body positive movement into what fat activist blogger Jess Baker has affectionately deemed Lisa Frank Bopo. And so Jess defines Lisa Frank Bopo as body positivity that, one, isn't intersectional, two, focuses on white and often thin bodies, and three, refuses to dig into the deep and critical political issues around comprehensive body liberation, and instead relies on topical positive messages to keep us all feeling cheerful and, most importantly, comfortable. And so this is the body positive conversation that, in my estimation, the aforementioned Instagram user was engaged with, and the one I assume many people in the room are familiar with. And there are certainly more radical contingents of a mainstream body positive movement, which consists of fat and thin people who are recovering from poor body image and the structures that influence it, primarily the diet industry. And so this facet encourages a divestment from dieting and the multi-billion industries that force a lifelong orientation towards weight loss or making bodies smaller by any means necessary, and deems whatever repercussions incurred in doing so as necessary and worthwhile collateral damage. All in the pursuit of beauty, but more specifically self-esteem through achieving beauty. And this emphasis on individual self-esteem and investment in beauty standards is one aspect I want to problematize. Because while this project on the surface seems harmless, even feel good, it fails to truly interrogate the root of why some bodies are considered ugly, and even more so, what is so problematic about that? In other words, what makes being in a body deemed ugly bad or difficult, and even further, by whose standards are we perceiving someone as ugly? Whose values are designating ugliness as an abject status, and conversely, beauty as a universally coveted status? I'm suspicious of narratives that suggest these considerations and valuations are innate to the human experience. And I'll go into this in further detail later in the talk, but for now I just want to flag this seemingly self-evident orientation towards beauty and the derision of cultural signs of ugliness. And to be fair, there are certainly activists who are working to integrate the mainstream local politics into more intersectional conversations that consider histories of race, racism, and colonialism. Two specifically I want to name and uplift are Sonia Rashawar, aka the Fat Sex Therapist, and Gloria Lucas, aka Nangona Positivity Pride, both of whom are active Instagram users and some of my personal favorite accounts. And so I want to highlight how these two memes that demonstrate how these activists are doing this. The first, from Sonia, reads race, class, and documentation status are body image issues. The next one, by Gloria, reads, if you want Indigenous people to heal their relationship with food and bodies, give the land back. So each of them go deeper into the conversation and the captions of their respective posts. And through these two examples, we can see how pretty directly they divest from Justice Lisa Frank Bopo, and centering fatness, people of color, indigeneity, and more complex aspects of embodiment, such as documentation status in relationship to the land. And while I'm not sure how Sonali or Gloria would consider themselves in relation to the mainstream body positive movement, I do acknowledge that they are both at least in consideration with it and making concerted efforts to push the conversations there, which are certainly much appreciated. But in line with Gloria and Sonali's interventions into the contemporary movement, I want to backtrack a bit to consider what began as the Fat Liberation Movement. So the Fat Liberation Movement dates back to the 1970s, United States, wherein fat activists began to organize around structural fat phobia. Most notably, there were activist groups like the Fat Underground, which responded to their experiences as fat, mostly white women. The Fat Liberation Manifesto, which is the inaugural document outlining the points of fat liberation, was written in 1973 by two women named Judy Freespirit and Aldebaran. And so while the activists of the time were aware of the material consequences of fat oppression, such as the collusion between the diet industry and the medical industrial complex, leading to the early deaths of and harm towards fat embodied subjects, and the specifically gendered aspects of fat phobia, nowhere in the 9-point manifesto does it center or emphasize individualistic relationships to our body or how we feel about them. Instead, it calls attention to the structures that cause harm and mistreatment towards fat women specifically, variously naming commercial and sexist interests and the financial interests of insurance companies, the fashion and garment industries, reducing industries, the food and drug industries, and the medical and psychiatric establishment. And so while the mainstream BOPO movement has shifted a bit to tackle what they deem diet culture, which encompasses many of these industries, it doesn't often manifest in a call to action in the same way that this document does. And so I also want to take a moment here to clarify that I'm not trying to point to some unproblematic or utopian past where we had it all figured out. As I mentioned, the Fat Underground was mostly white, most likely middle-class women who had the time and resources to organize. Rather, I'm just trying to place pressure on this genealogy to consider how we got from there to here. And what I think is important as the clearest delineation between these two movements, as well as what I'm here to speak to today, is the intersectional nature of the founding document for fat liberation. And though not explicitly cited, it seems clear that Judy Freespirit and Aldebaran were in conversation with other liberation movements of the time, most specifically the Black Panthers and the feminist movements, explicitly citing a solidarity with workers, people of color, and what we now would term the Global South, stating, quote, we see our struggle as allied with the struggles of other oppressed groups against classism, racism, sexism, ageism, financial exploitation, imperialism, and the like. And we can assume that allied with indicates a dedication to the freedom of all these groups. And so this is, so to speak, the crux of what I feel is missing from contemporary fat politics, and especially the body positivity movement. BOPO's neoliberal emphasis on feeling beautiful and restoring our individual relationships to food and body image don't necessarily challenge the larger structures and histories mentioned in the Fat Liberation Manifesto. But beyond what the Fat Liberation Manifesto frames as allied with, I want to argue that fat politics are actually integral to the contemporary movements against racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, and even imperialism. And this is because of how integrated anxieties around body size and aesthetics have been to the way racial politics have historically been shaped. So in his 2010 book, Embodying Black Experience, African-American cultural historian Harvey Young underscores that, quote, conceptions of Blackness are projected across individual bodies. An idea of the Black body materially affects actual bodies. So to unpack this a bit, what Young is speaking to here is the phenomenon of stereotypes of Blackness that result in material consequences. We see this when Black embodied subjects are, for example, racially profiled as innately criminal, resulting in them being overrepresented in prison populations, simply because ideas of blackness force black folks into direct contact with police more frequently than non-black people. This also results in undocumented black migrants being disproportionately deported or otherwise facing consequences for forced migration. We see this when black folks with natural hair lose job opportunities or reprimanded in school and workplaces for wearing their hair and cultural styles, which are derided as wholly unprofessional, unkept, or just unattractive, and generally out of the dress code for whatever the reprimanding establishment is. And I hope that we get the picture here. But ideas of blackness specifically are much more ubiquitous and subtle than they might seem. Anti-blackness also operates through ideology. So in May of this year, sociologist and professor at UC Irvine, Dr. Sabrina Strings, released her first monograph, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. The book revisits early conceptions of race science, its role in colonization, the related rise in class division, its emphasis on questions of women and embodiment. It's a great book, one that greatly influences my thinking, and I highly recommend it. Specifically, the book articulates how our contemporary understandings of fatness originated in questions of white women's beauty, and perhaps more importantly, their beauty potential. What began with questions as what is the ideal beautiful embodiment for white women evolved into sociocultural pressures for white women to achieve or maintain a particular kind of thin embodiment as evidence of racial superiority. Thinness as white beauty standards, and by extension white supremacy, was only possible and necessary in response to a prior correlation of fatness with blackness and indigeneity in the white imaginary, circulated by white European artists, philosophers, scientists, and academics in the colonial era, between approximately the 17th and 19th centuries. So the alleged predisposition to fatness in these communities, as well as the perception that they were more prone to see beauty, or at least not ugliness, and fatness, was taken as evidence of an inherent inferiority of black and indigenous populations around the world, contributing to the justification of their genocide, enslavement, and other displacement in favor of the white colonizer, whose superiority was evidenced by their cultural thinness. I say cultural thinness here because it's impossible to know if every colonizer, every slaveholder was actually thin. It doesn't matter. Regardless of their actual corporeality, they drew power institutionally from their socio-cultural belonging to the group that valued thinness as akin to white supremacy, relying on fat phobia to determine that entire groups of people were racially inferior. So at the formative moments of structuring race relations that continue to structure our contemporary world, a compulsory orientation towards thinness was born as a central tenet of white supremacy and the presumed innate superiority of white embodied subjects. No matter how whiteness was defined at any given moment, questions of body size is always an argument for or against their inclusion in ideological whiteness. As an example, Strings revisits early race scientists who attempt to articulate distinctions between the superior, or the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon and other races, which imagined the Irish as closer to African races, which they said was evidenced by their propensity for drinking and love of starchy foods such as the potato. So although these statements are clearly false and rooted in assumption, the ontological truths of this broad-based thinking and stereotypes is quite irrelevant. What is clear is that ideas of both blackness and whiteness structure ideas of fatness in the current historical moment. This was an obsession necessitated by anti-blackness, by an idea that black people and their vastly heterogeneous bodies in terms of height, weight, size, shape, skin color, eye color, hair, styling and texture, native tongue, etc., are inferior in the white imaginary. And as a reminder, the transatlantic slave trade was the backdrop for all of this science. And it feels important to name this a scientific thought, although we might like to discount these ideas as absurd and outdated, because they are. This is the history and the ideology that continues to underscore contemporary science and scientific practice, especially when it comes to fatness. But broadly, much of what we know today as scientific knowledge of the body is rooted in anti-black and even at times non-consensual practice and experimentation. But in terms of fatness, the histories that have determined fat corporeality to have negative health impacts have been revealed to be confirmation bias by white supremacists and fat-phobic practitioners, many of whom, especially recently, are laboring in service of funders with a vested financial interest in reifying a production of fatness as abject. And this is most clear when we see board members for various weight loss companies, products and supplements as the ones who are funding studies to find fatness to have some sort of alleged negative health impact. And of course, the science conveniently upholds the histories of white supremacy that produced these conceptions in the first place. Thinness becomes health, becomes white beauty, becomes racial superiority, justifying a paternalistic pathologization of communities of color for what is framed as an overrepresentation of fatness. And fat people of color imagine as unhealthy and unable to live up to white standards of beauty and living, which are evidenced by thinness. And so these are the questions I gestured to earlier when I asked what cultural values we are ascribing to in our devotion to beauty, regardless of its form. The contemporary body positive movement, one that tries to encourage us all to see our bodies as beautiful, fails to take into account who is defining beauty in the first place, who gives it meaning, and what meaning that is. And it's quite a complicated conversation, as we can see that the stakes of beauty are quite high. Attaining dominant standards of beauty comes with real material rewards. Not just self-esteem, but a more positive reception to you by others, which leads to more opportunities, statistically leads to higher wages, and generally a better quality of life. So I understand why there's such an emphasis on making all bodies feel beautiful, as if that will translate into the other rewards of beauty. But expanding notions of who or what is beautiful does little to disrupt the social investment and value in beauty. This is also not to say that white Europeans have a monopoly on beauty, but rather that the ideas attached to beauty, that beauty is a virtue, come from a deeply rooted white supremacist conception of social organization. It comes from a position to conceptualize and categorize not only bodies, but individual bodily attributes, ascribe them meaning, and then place them in related social hierarchies. So to unpack this a little bit further, I want to try to discuss something that is slightly outside my direct lane, but I think can also help complicate this concept and also demonstrate its ubiquity. So over the weekend, rapper Azealia Banks took to Instagram to fat shame Rihanna in a dedication posted to her stories. And admittedly, Banks opened her video by speaking to non-black people generally, but specifically white women, saying, quote, "Y'all wanna fucking eavesdrop on, black women's conversations. You feel me, white girls? I see how y'all are trying to inch your way into black women's culture. Y'all trying to get this fat Rihanna thing going, get this thing moving." And so I'm not 100% sure what exactly she's referencing, but news outlets who covered the story named she's critiquing the alleged body diversity in Rihanna's Savage Fenty show, which aired on Amazon Prime last week, which is why I haven't seen it. But she goes on to say, quote, "We will have no fat fucking black icons on this fucking side of the fucking art, fucking everything, bitch. No, you bitches are not gonna be fucking fat. I will not allow you to be fat. That's not like African excellence, bitch." She goes on to criticize black male rappers, specifically Jay-Z and Diddy, who function as gatekeepers of black beauty and who seemingly have endorsed Rihanna. And so I do want to be very careful in bringing this in, and name an awareness that much of the reason Azealia Banks makes such an easy and joyful target for so many is because she's a queer, dark-skinned black woman. And I want to intentionally hold generosity for Azealia, and I have no desire to do anything close to canceling her. She's a very talented artist and is dealing with and has dealt with struggles beyond my comprehension. But her statements of African excellence puzzle me, and I want to consider them in the context of histories of fat phobia being weaponized towards anti-black means. For one, they feel reminiscent of accusations that queerness is un-African, that it is a Western import with the intention of destroying African cultures. And we know that this is true, that queerness in many forms has existed all over the world for centuries, and that homophobia is truly the Western import. But for another, they are decontextualized some of the issues that I'm discussing here. So to be specific, the marriage of fatness and blackness did not come from nowhere or from conjecture. They came partially from a real-life historical figure named Sergey Parkman. Sergey Parkman was an indigenous South African woman from a people called the Khoikhoi. She was enslaved and transported to Europe to be put on display in London and France as exemplary of Africans as a whole around the turn of the 19th century. And this painting, used to declare and promote Bartman's arrival in Europe, is featured on the cover of Sabine Stream's book. And what made Bartman such a figure of awe and disgust to Europeans was her body size and shape. Bartman was perceived to have large hips, buttocks, and genitals. She is put on display as a grotesque figure of difference, exemplary of blackness, and central in the marriage of fatness and blackness in the white imaginary. And her full story is deeply upsetting, so I won't say much more about her, but I will highlight that her legacy in this conversation, as well as the larger relationships between fat phobia and anti-blackness, have been so deeply obscured under discourses of health and beauty that we can now have subjects who are targeted historically and present by the same misogynist structures can mobilize them under different guises. Parkman was deemed by some to be exemplary of African embodiment, and while it wasn't necessarily African excellence that her captors were capitalizing on, it was her perceived exceptionality as a fat embodied subject. But here we are, some 200 years later, and the racial origins of fat phobia have been so deeply obscured under discourses of both health and beauty that it now becomes a separate issue entirely, seemingly so deracialized that Black women can weaponize fat phobia against one another as legitimate critiques, even going so far as restaging at least some of the original designations of fatness as lowly, abject, ugly, and not exemplary of racial excellence. Despite its anti-Black origins, it has become a completely separate consideration, presenting a dangerous notion of the objective homogeneity of desirable embodiment. And so this is what I think that is missing from the body positive movement, but not just the body positive movement, from fat politics and even anti-racist movements of today. Anti-racist movements continue to outline the harmful forms of discrimination communities of color experience, their disproportionate targeting by the prison industrial complex, the scapegoating of immigrants of color by the current administration, the underfunding of schools with higher populations of children of color, school-to-prison pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. And while these are all true and valuable forms, aspects of the forms racism can and does take, I worry that the full extent of what race means and how those ideas have seeped into larger values and evaluation goes understudied or unacknowledged. Ideas of race and correlated attachments continue to permeate notions of good or bad, safe or dangerous, law-abiding or criminal, friendly or scary, or beautiful or ugly. And while some corners of the anti-racist movement have made efforts to recuperate aspects of embodiment from their objection under white supremacist beauty standards, the natural hair movement is one obvious example, but we're also beginning to see this in the abandonment of skin lightening creams and the embracement of darker skin tones. There's still quite a way to go in rescuing racialized embodiment from the Western gaze. Non-Black women such as Jennifer Lopez and the Kardashians have been critiqued for the celebration of their curves, which have been aptly identified as an appropriation of Black embodiment that is celebrated on non-Black women, but continues to not only be denigrated on Black bodies, but also justify their own oppression. And thanks to Kylie Jenner, we're also seeing larger lips become quite the fashion trend when transferred onto non-Black people. But outside of Beyonce's brief celebration of the beauty of the flat white sit nose on her husband, referenced as the Jackson 5 nostrils in formation, we've yet to see the same recuperation of white sit noses or the embracement of a variety of eye shapes that a body can produce. So the racialization of beauty standards also extends to body modifications, scars, and fatness. Even in a moment of the proliferation of so-called thickness and appropriation of African American vernacular English when spoken by non-Black people, where certain kinds of fatness are celebrated and desired, this designation still has limits that excludes most genres of fat people, especially those of us who are on the bigger end of the fat spectrum, in categories of what is called super fat or infinity fat. So what would an anti-racist fat politic look like? Anti-racist fat politics require dedication to not only unlearning and combating the more traditional targets of anti-racism in terms of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, immigration rights, prisons and policing, settlement and colonization, and so on. An anti-racist fat politic is not only fat positive, not body positive, fat positive, but it also necessitates a commitment to understanding and unpacking the varying valuations and aspects of embodiment are granted in proximity to white supremacist ideals. In many ways, an embracement of fatness as a neutral corporeality functions outside of and against these constructions. But while embracing the fat body as beautiful is a clear disruption and rejection of these histories, it doesn't always do the work we wish it would do. And so we need to not just embrace fat bodies, but especially those on the margins of fatness. Those who don't have the hourglass figures that are much more easily accepted by the mainstream, those who are super fat and infinity fat, designations which point to those on the fatter end of the spectrum and beyond the sizes catered to by straight size and plus size retailers alike, those who are of color, those who are trans, disabled, those with acne and acne scars, birthmarks, moles, or other forms of discoloration or bad skin. But we also need to develop an analysis of race beyond skin color and institutions, but a consideration of the ways our bodies have been so violently dissected into a variety of categories that are attached to racial valuations and subsequently weaponized against us. An anti-racist fat politic is a divestment from an investment in beauty as a white supremacist imagining and category, but also a divestment from all Western institutions of oppression, including the ongoing settlement of Turtle Island. And my own anti-racist politic is deeply informed by the Black feminist thought of the Combahee River Collective, with an understanding that centering the freedom of Black women is necessary because liberating Black women will necessarily liberate the rest of us. And it is informed by Audre Lorde's teaching that none of us are free while others are unfree. An anti-racist fat politics holds space for the complexity of Black women like Lizzo and Rihanna, yes, but also for Azealia Banks and others who might not always feel are aligned with our fat positive values, but who are still suffering under anti-Black racist and sexist structures. And so thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and I hope you all enjoyed. I'm excited to keep thinking about this with you all in the conversation that follows.
Thank you, Caleb. So I know some folks might have to move because of class and other things, but I wanted to open up to questions from the audience and give everyone a moment to think and reflect. No. I'm gonna do my little waiting for a question dance. Okay, to make everyone in the room comfortable, because I saw y'all taking notes, so I know the gears are turning.
So thank you. Follow you on Instagram. Love you so much. Like, wow, your essence, everything. I think thinking about this, how folks can implement this type of rhetoric in their day-to-day lives, what would you say would be kind of like a couple of steps for folks who have never had to think about this type of work before, for folks on this campus where it's expected that folks are supposed to look a certain way? For people who are trying to break out of that and unsure of how to, or have grown up in anti-fat lives, what would you suggest some necessary steps to living a life where you actively invest in removing structural barriers for fat folks, but also can be dealing with other intersecting forms of oppression?
Great question. And yeah, it's hard also because, like I said, there are actual rewards to like existing within like the privileged body, right? But I think in terms of fatness goes, in terms of how to like shift your relationship to fatness, I would say the easiest thing maybe for me, I don't know if it would be easy for y'all, is throw away your scale. You don't like scales are a really common I want to say accessory, or so, I don't know. They're just like a staple in people's lives that don't serve a whole lot of purpose. Like our body weight at any given moment isn't indicative of anything about us. It's going to change throughout the day. Just this, and having a scale just makes it so easy to step on it and just check your weight and then come to some conclusion about yourself based on what that number is. That really, unless there's some like medical reason, like you're taking medication that has a weight limit, which is also fat phobic, right? That like medicine can be, it should be for everybody, but some medicines have weight limits, or you need different doses at different sizes. I know for some athletes or sports, like you have to maintain a certain weight for a certain class or whatever. But beyond those things, which I also like feel complicated about, throw away your scale. You know, when you go to exercise, don't I when I go to the gym and there's like it immediately tells you like how many calories you burned or whatever. I just like close that screen because that stuff is not important to me. Like what's important to me is the fact that I move my body, that I feel good, that I made some personal goal to myself. But like I don't actually need to check those things, right? Um, what else? Um, yeah, to interrogate like what I guess if you have um if you have an experience where you're like, oh, I feel fat or I look fat, like challenge yourself and what you actually mean in those moments and what does what is fat seating in for in those moments? Do you feel unattractive, which is not always like fat people aren't inherently unattractive, right? Do you feel sleepy? Do you feel tired? Do you need to have a bowel movement? Like what's going on in your body to make you feel that way? And you can kind of, and then you can attach fatness to more. One of my practices is shifting an orientation to fatness because something I notice is we have this like in some ways we really value size, right? Like we value a big bank account or if this cake is really rich or well endowed genitals, so to speak, right? So like in these other ways we have these appreciations and devotions to size, and so I'm really into like shifting the rhetoric around fatness for that. So I think I'm being confusing, but I'll give an example. I'm like on my own healing journey, right? And so when I talk about like the emotional growth that I've made, I talk about it as getting emotionally fatter, as an example, as just a way to shift the orientation to fatness and the connotations that it has, if that helps.
I have to admit, I wasn't acquainted with this discussion a lot. So I had a question about like what would fat liberation really involve, and like I know, like I don't know if I'm making a mistake here, but like in scientific studies, there's often referred to how like a rise in weight is correlated with other things, but I also know that these studies are also used as like excuses to oppress. So, how do you think you can reconcile the two things for fat liberation?
Specifically, like the way that fatness is considered under like scientific models of health. Well, yeah, a lot of studies come to the conclusion that being fat is unhealthy. And I kind of mentioned it in the talk, but what's coming out recently in the field of fat studies is people are looking at who's funding those studies, and it turns out that basically rich people who are going to make a lot of money off of making people feel bad about themselves are behind those studies, right? So like the CEO of Weight Watchers is going to fund a study to say that being fat is bad for your health, and so that then they can say, come to my Weight Watchers meeting and sign up for this membership, right? And they're it's literally this giant elaborate ruse. Another thing that these studies don't take into consideration are other aspects of health and other things that inform your health and livelihood. Like example, money and where you live. I am a grad student right now, and I have high blood pressure, and I like go to the campus center, and they're like, one of the things that contributes to high blood pressure is stress, and they're like, oh, but that's unavoidable as a grad student, which is a lie. There's so many things that the university can do to make my life as a grad student less stressful, most notably by giving me more money, so that I don't I'm not constantly stressed about that. But that is seen as an unreasonable solution, and instead they're like, you need to do all these things about your body that's wrong, right? And it's like actually, especially like as a first generation student, like a lot of my colleagues are coming from families that have a lot of money and that they have families that they can rely on financially in ways that I can't. And so that's one way that like my health gets contributed to my body size and not actually like my location and an entire web of socioeconomic histories and structures. Yeah, does that answer that?
How do you think everything that we've talked about and whether or not you fit into this like thin white ideal versus not, how does that affect someone's I guess their disposition towards their sexuality that you've seen or experienced?
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking about like the way that we think about our bodies is also going to affect the way that we approach our own sexuality. So like, what do you think you see in terms of that, or can you speak to that at all?
I think, if I'm understanding your question correctly, my experience has been that it's about our bodies, but it's also about the way that people respond to our bodies, right? So I know people that fall outside of these dominant standards of beauty that come from really loving and supportive families, and they don't have. I don't, for that. And so we don't view our bodies the same way, and they don't have the same sort of hangups and insecurities that I have because my family produced those in me, right? Or they have different, just different counter narratives to respond to them. Like my mom is super homophobic, so it's hard. That informs my sexuality, right? In a way that queer people who don't have homophobic parents don't have the same hangups. The other thing I think that your question touches on is this idea that people who fall into the dominant beauty standards like are great and like have it made, and that's also not true, right? Those people have their own insecurities. They're dissatisfied with their bodies in its own way. It's like the stakes are much different. Like they're still receiving the social rewards of having that body, but it doesn't necessarily automatically produce a positive relationship to your body. It doesn't mean your partner's not going to cheat on you. It doesn't mean that the person you like is going to love you back. You know, it doesn't mean that you're going to get all the dates that you want. So yeah, I think there is an aspect of it that is about our relationship to our bodies, but I think that it's a much more social process, and it's much more about what messages you receive, not just growing up, but from your community now.
Someone mentioned before they follow you on Instagram, and I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit about like what you post, what you hope to achieve with that, and how that kind of interacts with your craft work?
Yes, my Instagram is Chairbreaker, and it's actually question is interesting because I actually just recently hit 10,000 followers, so like the number changed, which is like cute, but it also like produces this weird anxious relationship to my Instagram now where I feel like I have to like produce content and can't just like post a selfie. But before that, I would just like post selfies, or just like what's going on in my life. I do try to use my Instagram story in a way that I feel like I used to use Tumblr. I came up on Tumblr I don't know how many other people did, but I really like this practice of like social media, there's so many ways to use it, and my favorite way is by getting free information out there and sharing it. And so I try to use it to share about like memes and funny stuff, but also about like real important shit going on in the world. I try to follow a variety of people so that I get a variety of perspectives, and so that also so I hear about a variety of issues. Like I wouldn't hear about the occupation of Kashmir if I wasn't following Sonia, the fat sex therapist, right? Like, and so I also try to, because I know that a lot of people come to me because I'm a fat person and they're fat too, and maybe they don't feel better about themselves. But like, ending fat oppression isn't going to solve all the world's problems, right? So I try to be really conscientious in what I share and try to extend people who maybe came to me because I'm fat, but maybe they have some anti-blackness to work on, or maybe they're not really as thinking about colonization and settlement in the ways that I think we should be. And so I try to bring in those issues also.
So first of all, thank you so much. This was incredible. I think one of the things that I was thinking about a lot throughout your whole talk was how conversations surrounding issues like fat phobia tend to be commodified on this campus. You know, it's like a 1.5 hour workshop you can fit into your lunch break or something. You can like, oh, I'm free from 4 to 6, so I'm going to go to this one time a month body positive workshop, and that's how I'm going to like feel better about myself, and I'm going to like check that off as like sort of my work for the day. And I was thinking about ways, and this is something I think about with like queer organizing and other organizing on this campus, to like sort of integrate radical aspects of politics into other forms of programming on campus, you know, coalition building. And there's sort of these coalitions that come naturally, you know, talking about Black body positivity with like anti-fat phobic conversations, or like queerness tied with fighting against rhetoric of fat phobia. Do you have any way to speak, could you speak a little bit on ways to sort of incorporate that in spaces on campuses, you know, as a grad student, in which those conversations just aren't happening, or it doesn't seem natural for people to bring in a conversation about like systemic fat phobia?
Yeah, I kind of get, not as much, but when I first entered grad school, there was kind of this like, well, what's this question of like who my work is speaking to or who it's relevant to, right? Because it's perceived as only speaking to fat people, but like fatness is about bodies, and literally everybody has a body. It's like the one thing that unites us all is that we all have a body, right? And we're all impacted by this way of thinking about bodies. And I also my framework is that it's not, bodies aren't just conceptualized in terms of size, but when we talk about race, when we talk about gender, when we talk about sexuality, about religion, about documentation status, these are also questions of bodies, right? Questions of ways the bodies have been organized and categorized and perceived and placed in a social hierarchy. So I try to really just like scale it back to the bare minimum, and just a reminder that like we literally all have bodies. We all consume food that has calorie packages on the label, right? Like we're all constantly being like, first of all, we all have to eat. Some of us don't eat, or like are navigating that in other like really horrific and sad ways. But like we're living organisms that need to, and all living organisms need to eat. And then in this moment, like all of our food, unless I guess you go to a farmer's market, it has this information on it that is telling you what you should eat so that you don't become fat. Basically, like that's the point of posting your calories, right? So like this idea that like these topics are like niche or don't pertain to everybody, just like I don't buy it. Does that okay?
So thank you so much. This was absolutely brilliant. And recognizing the massive diversity among indigenous and colonized folks, are there ways that there are practices specific to indigenous folks or colonized folks, or that you know of and that you think would be helpful, while also according on to the fact that it was theirs and still is?
I don't. I'm gonna say something and I don't know if it's gonna answer your question or if it's gonna be responding to your question, but this is what's coming up for me. Over the summer, I worked with my department chair to host these two different groups of Indigenous people. Some Aboriginal folks from the Yuji Nation in Australia, and then some folks from the Northern Pomo tribe in Northern California. And they met on the Wrigley campus and had they did a performance. And what I thought was so interesting was that I feel like, especially with Western dance, right? And so they were Indigenous dancers. And so with Western dance, especially, there's this idea of what a dancer's body looks like, especially if you're going to be shirtless on the stage, right? Like, if you're going to be a dancer that's shirtless on the stage, you are expected to have if you're female assigned at birth, you're expected to be very thin and toned maybe, but softer, right? And then male assigned folks are expected to have musculature and all this stuff. And that was just not the case with these folks. They just danced with the bodies that they had, and it didn't mean that they had to accommodate their costumes so that it was showing less of their bodies if it wasn't fitting in the dominant standard. It was just this is your body, this is a traditional costume, and you're gonna dance. And so I think just the idea that, and like you said, Indigenous folks around the world is a vastly heterogeneous group. And so it's hard to speak to all of them, and I think especially, it's funny, I'm reading a novel right now, actually, Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, that is written by a Two-Spirit First Nations person. Actually, I don't know if they identify as Two-Spirit now. I think they do. Okay, sorry. There was some speak. I'll just talk about that. But so there's that part, right, of Indigenous traditions just not considering the body that way. But there's also this other part where here on Turtle Islands, part of the ongoing genocide of Indigenous folks is by placing them on reservations where they have very little access to healthy foods. And a lot of times that means that they become fat. And so there's this correlation of fatness with Indigenous folks in the US. And I'm actually the more I read about, so there's this novel that I just mentioned, and there's also this Indigenous poet, Tommy Pico, whose work is kind of coming on the rise. And I see these interesting references to how on the res they were fat, and then especially having left the res and then trying to be urban gay men, they can't be fat anymore. And so there's this interesting there's an interesting shift that happens in that movement that I think also it speaks to the ongoing issues of colonization, and also speaks to the earlier question that a lot of times, because these populations are considered disproportionately fat, that's then they get targeted as being unhealthy, and then they become the targets of these projects to make them healthier and but being colonized is really bad for your health, right? Living on this land that is your traditional territory, or maybe not even the land that you're on your traditional territory, but where your tribe has been moved to, that produces a lot of the negative health outcomes that get attributed to fatness. And so there's this like other way that here on Turtle Island that like fatness is becoming this mask to continually oppress indigenous people, but it's actually not really fatness. It's about what foods they have access to. It's about their lands being colonized. It's about the way they're treated. It's about the ways they experience racism, and how all of that is bad for health.
We're gonna do one more. And you got
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. It resonated a lot with what I was reading about and talking about in some of my classes and some of the programs that I'm in. At one point, I'm in a leadership role on campus, and I wanted to do a general meeting about fat phobia in the Black community, especially. And I was shot down by my fellow leaders, other people in leadership, and instead they came up with, oh, we should do a general meeting on healthy eating at college. Can you give any information on how I should have responded and like what I can do to further push the issue about the importance of talking about fat phobia and the intersectionality of us being Black or being POC and how it affects us?
That's a great, yeah, I know that I talked a lot about Blackness in my talk because I think it's important for non-Black people to combat anti-Blackness, but I'm also aware that I'm not Black, so I like have like I don't know, it's a difficult line to dance, but I think maybe one suggestion is reading the Sabrina Strings book, because that I think is or maybe even just a few chapters of the book. If you can like suggest a reading group or something like that, maybe you can bring her to talk about it. There's also another scholar, Andrea Shawn Evans, who wrote a book, The Embodiment of Disobedience, and it's specifically about fat Black women in the Western Hemisphere. And I think those would be two ways and it's like complicated too because African American communities particularly like they're one of these populations that gets targeted as having like unhealthy cultural practices, particularly through food, and that gets correlated as like and then there's discourse around like incidences of high blood pressure, hypertension, right, in African American communities. But continental Black folks don't have the same health issues regardless of body size. So we can see that it's actually like the experience of anti-Blackness is contributing to those things more than body size. But I imagine that because that's so correlated culturally and discursively, that like that might produce a lot of anxiety. But yeah, that would be my my recommendation, or seeking other like fat Black artists or fat Black performers or workers and kind of bringing them into this space, or shining some light onto that.
So I just want to thank again Caleb for coming and speaking with us today. Follow them on Instagram, Trailbreaker. Follow us on Instagram. So thank you all so much for coming. We're grateful to have you in community and conversation. If you can all be sure to clean up after yourselves and help stack chairs if you can, it'd be much appreciated. And we hope to see you here next week for Sonia, Renee, Taylor.
Thank you. Like, to answer those questions. Yes, I can it's like kind of weird. It's so good. I mean, it's really get very public integration. This is gonna start now.
Yeah, I'm from the about anything.
The only one I've heard, well, dating the hips symphony.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking of that because this one is teaches them. And they just approved like the yeah.
I was gonna say the only one I've heard about is
Okay.
maybe it's on like alphabet.
Yeah, I wanted to, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's so many that are blocking them.
Yeah, they must be because it's definitely not meditation.
Okay. No, because I don't feel worried. No.
Yeah, no, you're right. You guys were like, everybody else is kind of like got them in that person too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brenda's is the Sam. They did have studies and Brenda's before.
Okay, maybe yeah. Maybe right now. No, it's not.
We don't hear of any.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, all good.
Oh, wait, August, you work for Chicken Flip.
I
You don't need to go about it.
So the middle size is like female body or like dress size. It sounds so it could also be like that's just like it's to create like a piece of like butterflies or even apologize for letting measure. Considering it starts at 0, which we already consider.
I can't.
It was go to these every 11:30 Tuesday.
Yeah, no, so I'm now at like a affiliate.
My first year was every single from Stromberg, and I finally got into this space.
Now you're in.
Yeah, now I'm in.
I'm not going to